The night before Kurt Cobain was found, the house on Lake Washington Boulevard was quieter than usual. The windows were shut against the cold, the lights dim, and the rooms held that stillness that settles in old houses long after midnight. Yet somewhere beneath the floorboards, between the furnace hum and the soft ticking of old pipes, a sound began to register on a forgotten piece of equipment in the basement. A handheld recorder Kurt used months earlier for melody scraps he never finished. The device had been left on a shelf, its batteries weak, its tape half spooled. No one had touched it since winter, but at 2:47 a.m. it came to life. The recording didn't begin with a button click or the mechanical pop of a reel turning. Instead, the magnetic tape simply activated. A faint hiss grew in the darkness, followed by a low oscillation, like someone breathing too close to the microphone. It lasted 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly. It had not been turned on. It had been triggered by something in the room. Later, investigators would dismiss the tape fragment as electrical noise caused by temperature fluctuation. But the timestamp burned into the device's internal counter matched an unusual power dip recorded by the house's breaker panel at the exact same moment. And when the tape was slowed down, the hiss formed a pattern, too steady for mechanical noise, too unstable for human breath. It rose and fell in a rhythm that didn't belong to any known source in the house. Hours earlier, Kurt's friend Dylan had visited briefly, dropping off some items and checking in before leaving him alone for the night. He mentioned nothing unusual, just a tired look on Kurt's face, the scattered notebooks on the floor, the half-written lyrics on the table that seemed to have been abandoned mid-thought. Dylan noted that Kurt appeared quieter than usual, withdrawn, but not distressed. Nothing suggested that the house would become the center of so many unanswered questions. Nothing hinted at the recording that would awaken in the basement long after Dylan drove away. But the tape wasn't the only device that behaved strangely that night. On the main floor, Kurt's answering machine registered 2 blank calls between 1 and 3 a.m. No caller ID, no message, just silence, and then a disconnect tone. The first call lasted 3 seconds. The second didn't even reach one. The phone logs showed no incoming numbers, as if the machine had invented the connections on its own. Neighbors, when interviewed later, spoke of nothing unusual except for one detail they almost forgot to mention: a thin, metallic hum that drifted from the woods behind the house sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock. They assumed it was distant machinery or late-night construction, but one neighbor, an elderly man living 2 houses down, insisted the sound pulsed in intervals, like a broken engine trying to start, or like something breathing. Inside the house, the temperature logs recorded an inexplicable drop, 4 degrees in less than a minute around the same time. The thermostat registered the change but didn't activate the heating system, as if the sensors had been bypassed. When technicians later examined the unit, they found no faults, no errors, no reason for the dip. It was simply there, then gone. What is certain is this: Kurt Cobain spent his final hours alone in a house that was not entirely silent. Every piece of evidence, every small anomaly, every clipped second of audio suggests movement, presence, or input, yet no person reported being there. The basement recorder wasn't plugged into the wall. The answering machine couldn't generate calls without external signals. And the timestamp, 2:47 a.m., corresponded to no known activity in the house, yet something activated the tape. Kurt's journals from the period hint at sleeplessness, at nights punctured by sounds he couldn't place: soft footsteps, distant vibrations, muffled static behind the walls. He wrote about moments of cold air sweeping through the room without a window open. He wrote about the strange sensation of being watched not from across the room, but from above, as though someone leaned over him when he closed his eyes. And in one entry from that week, scribbled at an angle as if written in haste, he wrote 4 words: "Something came back tonight." Investigators never connected these notes to the events of the final night. They never tied the electrical dip, the phantom calls, or the tape fragment to anything meaningful. But if the basement recorder is taken at face value, if the mechanical tape truly responded to something in its environment, then Kurt's last night wasn't silent. It was documented unintentionally by a device that should have stayed dead, and that leaves only one question: what moved in the house at 2:47 a.m.? When technicians later analyzed the 2:47 a.m. basement recording, they expected to find nothing more than mechanical distortion. Old tape, failing batteries, the predictable decay of analog equipment forgotten in a cold room. But the waveform told a different story. The hiss that began the moment the tape activated didn't behave like random noise. It rose in clean intervals, almost evenly spaced, like something modulating the air pressure directly in front of the microphone. And beneath the hiss was a second layer, sub-audible vibrations that only appeared when the recording was slowed far beyond normal playback. The technician who discovered the pattern described it carefully, as though unsure whether he should even write it down. "It looks like something breathing, but the wavelength is too long to be human." He ran the sample again, isolating only the low frequencies, and the breath-like rise became more defined. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Each cycle lasted nearly twice as long as human respiration. Something was there, something too slow, too heavy, too consistent. This discovery led investigators back to the answering machine anomalies. Those 2 blank calls, logged without caller IDs, had bothered the original team for reasons they couldn't articulate. Now, examined in the context of the basement tape, they seemed less like glitches and more like reactions, brief activations triggered by the same environmental force that awakened the recorder. The second call occurred just 5 minutes after the tape fragment. And when they aligned the timestamps, they noticed the house's electrical panel registered another power dip at almost the same moment the answering machine clicked on. Taken separately, these events meant little. Together, they drew a map of something moving through the house at a steady pace. Basement, first floor, living room. The power dips were like footprints. In each case, they lasted less than a second, as though the electrical field of the house had been momentarily displaced, disrupted, then allowed to settle again. Someone or something had passed near the wiring. Dylan, when contacted a second time, mentioned something he had forgotten. When he left the house that night, he heard a soft thud from inside after closing the door, as though someone had moved. Not footsteps, not furniture, more like something shifting its weight or adjusting position. He assumed it was the house settling, but the sound came from the direction of the basement stairs, exactly where the tape would activate hours later. Another overlooked detail emerged from the initial walkthrough of the house. A frame picture in the hallway was slightly tilted, not by a small accidental angle, but by a full 3 inches from level. Investigators chalked this up to vibration or someone brushing past it, but the floor beneath the frame was dusted with a fine layer of insulation, the kind that falls when something disturbs the attic beams. Yet the attic was untouched and Kurt rarely went there. The dust pattern suggested downward impact, not upward, as if something had pressed against the ceiling above the picture before the movement. When technicians analyzed the dust more closely, they found tiny fibers embedded in it, fibers consistent with acoustic foam. But Kurt had stored his acoustic panels in the basement. They were intact, unmounted, and stacked neatly. There was no reason for the fibers to appear upstairs. The movement pattern grew stranger when the team examined the furnace logs. At 2:45 a.m., just 2 minutes before the tape activated, the furnace registered a sudden airflow reversal. This could occur if a door opened quickly, creating pressure imbalance. But all exterior doors were closed and locked, and interior doors showed no signs of movement. The airflow pattern suggested an opening, but none existed. If something created that shift, it didn't use a door. Then came the missing 32 seconds. On the house's internal wiring logs, between 2:46:21 and 2:46:53 a.m., the breaker panel recorded a dropout so complete that it resembled a blackout, but only for the internal sensors. The lights didn't flicker, appliances didn't restart. It was as if the house forgot to record those seconds. And the moment the system came back online, the basement recorder activated. This blackout didn't appear in the original report. It was buried in the raw log files and overlooked until a specialist reconstructed the house's digital timeline years later. But its proximity to the tape activation was too precise to ignore. Something entered or passed through the basement at exactly 2:47 a.m., and the house responded, not with alarms, not with movement logs, but with a momentary erasure of time. When investigators compared this blackout to Kurt's journals, they found an entry that suddenly made more sense. A week before his death, he wrote about a moment I can't remember, a few seconds missing from the room. He described standing at the top of the stairs and feeling the air thicken, like stepping into a vacuum. The next thing he remembered was blinking and realizing he was already at the bottom of the stairs without recalling how he moved. He dismissed it as exhaustion, but the timestamp on the journal page, scribbled like an afterthought, read, "Around 3." 2 days later, he wrote, "The quiet part of the house is not quiet." Investigators spent years arguing about whether these entries were metaphorical or literal, but in the context of the 2:47 a.m. tape, the blank calls, the electrical footprints, and the missing 32 seconds, the journal notes appeared less like artistic rambling and more like observational fragments, thoughts documented by someone who sensed the presence of something he couldn't describe. The technician analyzing the tape fragment ran one final test. He mapped the breathing-like pattern onto a spectrogram and compared it to known mechanical and environmental signatures. It didn't match the furnace, the pipes, the electrical hum, or the wind. It matched nothing in the house. And yet, the waveform bore the unmistakable signature of proximity. Something had been within inches of the microphone. No one was in the basement at 2:47 a.m. No one moved through the house. No one entered or left, but something did. When the 2:47 a.m. basement tape was played on higher-grade analog equipment, something unexpected happened. The sound seemed to change character depending on the machine used, as though the original recording resisted being interpreted clearly. On cheaper players, the hiss was uniform. On professional decks, the sound broke into layers, multiple frequencies appearing and disappearing like threads in a frayed fabric. It gave the unsettling impression that the tape was not a single recording, but several overlapping impressions captured in a moment the device wasn't meant to respond to. To understand why the recorder activated at all, analysts examined its internal mechanism. The model was an old handheld unit Kurt used during writing sessions. Basic motor, cheap magnetic tape, manual buttons. It had no voice activation. It could not turn itself on. And yet the motor engaged long enough to capture 5 seconds of sound before shutting down. One technician proposed an electrical surge, but the recorder wasn't plugged in. It ran on failing AA batteries that should not have provided enough power for spontaneous activation. The machine behaved as though an external signal manipulated the motor directly, bypassing the mechanical trigger. This finding led investigators back to the basement itself, a room cluttered with leftover instruments, cables coiled on shelves, amplifiers stacked like forgotten monuments to earlier sessions. Kurt used the space mainly for brainstorming riffs, leaving tapes scattered, notebooks half open, ideas abandoned mid-sentence. Among the equipment was a small analog mixer with a built-in microphone that had not been powered in months. During the second sweep of the house, an investigator noticed faint dust displacement on the mixer's knobs, as if someone had brushed against them recently. The mixer was cold. The power cable was unplugged, yet the dust suggested contact. Could the breathing-like sound on the tape have come from the mixer's microphone instead of the handheld device? It was a possibility until they checked the internal counter of the handheld recorder. It showed the motor spinning at the exact moment of the recording. Both devices could not have been activated simultaneously unless two separate disturbances occurred in the same room at the same time. One technician remarked quietly, "It wasn't the tape picking up sound, it was the sound picking up the tape." Meanwhile, a neighbor came forward with a testimony investigators had overlooked. She lived directly behind the house, separated only by a line of trees. On the night before Kurt's death, she was awake around 2:30 a.m. and remembered hearing something faint drifting from the direction of the basement windows. A vibration more than a noise, like an instrument string being touched lightly, not played, just disturbed. When she listened more closely, it faded, replaced by a deep stillness she described as pressure dropping in the room. She assumed she imagined it until she later heard the timeline of events. Her account placed the vibration minutes before the tape activated. The question then arose, was the sound on the tape coming from inside the room or from the house itself? A structural acoustics expert analyzed the resonance on the 2:47 a.m. fragment and found something alarming. The waveform didn't match typical basement acoustics: concrete floor, low ceiling, box geometry. Instead, the resonance resembled a larger space with hollow areas, as though the microphone picked up echoes from above or behind the walls. But the basement walls were solid. No crawl space, no ventilation shafts wide enough to carry sound. For the resonance to appear as it did, something had to shift the air around the microphone, creating reflections impossible in a static environment. If the sound didn't originate naturally from the basement, then it was interacting with the basement. That distinction unsettled even the most grounded analysts. Adding to the confusion were inconsistencies in the timeline recorded by police. The official report stated that no unusual activity occurred in the house between midnight and the morning the body was found. But early logs showed that officers originally noted uncertain time gaps in the overnight hours. These notes were removed in the finalized report. The precinct's internal timestamps didn't align with external documentation. Dispatch logs listed calls from neighbors at times not mentioned in the report. And surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured a police cruiser slowly driving past the house at 4:12 a.m. Yet no officer acknowledged being near the property at that hour. The time anomalies extended inside the house too. The kitchen clock showed 8:37 a.m. frozen, while the living room clock displayed 9:14 a.m. Neither matched the coroner's estimated time of death, and the watch found near Kurt had stopped entirely at some point before sunrise, its mechanical gears jammed as though exposed to a sudden jolt of magnetism. This detail was dismissed, But magnetism substantial enough to freeze a watch could easily interfere with analog recording equipment. And what else in the house had been exposed to sudden magnetic interference? The 2:47 a.m. tape. In the basement itself, investigators noticed objects that seemed out of place. A small stool was angled toward the far wall, not the center of the room where Kurt typically sat. A notepad lay open on the floor despite early responders insisting it has been closed when they first entered. A guitar cable was half uncoiled, the tip resting near the recorder, not plugged in but positioned as though someone had moved it recently. None of the officers recalled touching these items. None of them had reason to, and yet their positions changed between photographs taken only minutes apart. These discrepancies increased when the team examined photographs from the morning Kurt was found. In one image, a set of small footprints, dust prints, not shoe prints, appeared on the basement floor near the shelves where the recorder was discovered. They were faint, uneven, like impressions from something with soft edges, not a human shoe. In the next photograph, taken just moments later, they were gone. The dust was undisturbed. The prints had vanished completely. Investigators at the time chalked this up to lighting, photography angles, or smudging. But digital enhancement showed something else. The dust around the vanished prints had a subtle swirl pattern as though disturbed by a sudden movement of air strong enough to erase the impressions, but delicate enough not to scatter dust elsewhere. Like something passed through them, not over them. The more the timeline was reconstructed, the more it unraveled. The events between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. refused to align into a coherent narrative. The electrical dips, the blank calls, the missing seconds, the altered objects, the erased dust, each pointed to movement, but none pointed to a person. Everything converged on the same impossible truth. The basement recorder didn't malfunction, it reacted. The house wasn't silent, it responded. Something moved through it, leaving behind evidence too faint for human senses, but too clear for machines to ignore. And if the tape captured even a fraction of that movement, then the 2:47 a.m. fragment might not be the only recording created that night. When first responders entered the house later that morning, their focus was on the greenhouse room upstairs, not the basement. The early steps taken through the hallway were practical, procedural, and hurried. But in those brief moments, they passed details that would become crucial years later. Details they didn't register at the time because none of them expected the case to fracture into the unsolved segment it eventually became. One of those unnoticed details lay on the landing near the stairwell, a thin trail of insulation fibers barely visible against the wooden floor. The fibers were aligned not in a random scatter, but in a faint directional arc, as though displaced by a burst of airflow or by something brushing past at speed. They led toward the basement door, stopping abruptly before the first step. None of the responders wore clothing that could shed that type of fiber. It matched the acoustic foam from the basement, yet none of the foam panels were disturbed. The fibers seemed transferred, carried by movement rather than falling naturally. Inside the greenhouse, the scene was static, cold, heavy. Everything appeared exactly where it should have been except for one object, the cordless phone placed near Kurt's right side. Investigators later learned that Kurt had made a phone call the night before, around 1:17 a.m. But the recording of that call, preserved by the telephone company's automated system, had a gap, 18 seconds cut from the center of the audio. The system generated a log stating signal collapse, a rare error meaning the audio stream continued, but the recorded data vanished. The collapse occurred at 1:17:44 a.m., a moment Kurt's friend remembered as the point when his voice suddenly grew quieter, as if he had turned his head or someone stepped between him and the receiver. But the friend insisted Kurt had been alone. When technicians reconstructed the partial call, they discovered something disconcerting. The frequencies leading up to the collapse did not taper off gradually, as they would if someone simply moved the phone. Instead, the waveform bent, literally bent, showing a distortion curve similar to electromagnetic interference. And when the call resumed, the background noise was different. The tonal signature of the room had shifted, faintly but measurably, as though the space around Kurt had changed shape during those missing 18 seconds. It was around this point in the timeline reconstruction that investigators revisited the greenhouse door. Photographs taken that morning revealed a subtle warp on the edge of the frame. Nothing dramatic, just a slight inward bend that didn't match the door's typical curvature. Carpenters who later examined the frame said it looked like the wood had expanded rapidly in one spot, as if exposed to a sudden surge of heat or pressure. Yet the door was cool to the touch when first responders arrived. The warp wasn't from fire or weather. It looked more like compression, like something had pressed against the door from the inside, not hard enough to break it, but firmly enough to alter its shape. Then there was the answering machine. Officers reported seeing it unplugged on the kitchen counter, though records indicated it had been connected to the phone line when the blank calls were logged in the early morning hours. The cord lay on the counter close to the device, but the outlet beside it showed no sign of disturbance. The plug didn't look yanked or removed forcefully. Instead, it looked as though the cord had fallen from the outlet without friction, something physically improbable. And when technicians tested the outlet, it functioned perfectly. If someone unplugged the machine, they didn't do it by hand. Then came the most puzzling element, the silent playback. During the second walkthrough, an officer pressed the play button on the answering machine, expecting silence. But the machine emitted a faint click, mechanical, empty, followed by a low, uneven hum that lasted less than a second. The officer described it as an electrical swallow, a sound he had never heard from an answering machine before. The device had no stored messages, no tape, no memory, yet it behaved as if trying to replace something that wasn't there. A later analysis suggested the hum matched part of the 2:47 a.m. basement recording, specifically the low-frequency resonance beneath the hiss. How could two unrelated devices operating on different floors capture fragments of the same anomaly? The official report offered no answer. Meanwhile, the patterns in the basement grew stranger. Investigators documented 3 small objects that appeared in different positions between photo sets: a metal pick, a lighter, and a guitar slide. In the first set, the items rested on a shelf. In the next, they lay scattered on the floor. No one recalled touching them, yet the displacement suggested directional force. Each object moved along the same angle toward the center of the room. Technicians examining the scene noticed faint streaks of static electricity along the metal surfaces. Normally, such patterns occur when someone drags metal across synthetic fabric. But the basement floor was concrete, there was no fabric, and the streaks were too uniform, too evenly spaced to be accidental. One analyst proposed an electromagnetic disturbance, but nothing in the house, no wiring, no equipment, could generate the pattern without producing far stronger anomalies elsewhere. But anomalies were everywhere. The electrical panel showed another brief dropout around 3:03 a.m., just 16 minutes after the tape activated. This second disturbance was shorter, less than half a second, but it coincided with a sudden spike in the house's ambient temperature sensors. The spike lasted only long enough to register on a single data point, then disappeared. When mapped visually, the temperature line rose sharply, like a breath of warm air had passed through the room, then fell back into place. This 3:03 a.m. spike aligned with something far stranger: the metallic hum heard by the neighbor. The timestamp she gave, roughly 3 o'clock, matched the sensor data almost exactly. Her description of the hum, rising and falling in slow pulses, echoed the breathing-like rhythm found on the tape fragment. It was as though the same presence that activated the recorder had moved through the house again, leaving subtle but measurable disturbances in its wake. Investigators also discovered a short section of cable on the basement floor bent in an unnatural arc. The copper wiring inside showed microfractures typically caused by sudden torque, not gradual pressure, yet no one had stepped on it, no one had handled it, and the bend pointed toward the shelf where the handheld recorder sat. All these pieces, phone anomalies, electrical fluctuations, displaced objects, vanished dust prints, warped door frames, created a portrait of motion without a mover, a timeline filled with actions but devoid of actors. Something moved through the house, leaving traces too precise to ignore but too incomplete to understand. And then came the discovery that shifted the investigation entirely. Hidden in the metadata of the basement recorder's counterlog was a reference timestamp from earlier in the night, one the device should not have been awake to create. It indicated a brief motor spin at 12:31 a.m. No sound was recorded, no tape moved, but the internal wheel turned just enough to create a marker. The spin lasted less than a fraction of a second, but the timestamp was unmistakable. The recorder had tried to activate once before. It failed until 2:47 a.m. Something had approached the basement earlier that night, paused, and moved on. Something that returned later with enough force to awaken a dead recorder and imprint its presence onto magnetic tape. And somewhere between those moments, between 12:31 and 2:47, between blank calls and missing seconds, Kurt Cobain experienced something he did not write down, something not preserved in journals or phone logs, something only the house remembered. The deeper the analyst went into the 2:47 a.m. recording, the less it behaved like anything they had encountered before. On a standard spectrogram, the fragment looked like a brief swell of noise tapering off into silence. But when they stretched the waveform to many times its length, a hidden structure emerged. The hiss wasn't a solid block, it was woven. Thin bands of frequency rose and fell inside it, like threads crossing each other at irregular intervals. One audio specialist likened it to the sound of two rooms occupying the same space for a second and a half. When the fragment was looped and layered onto itself, something even stranger appeared. For a split instant, less than a single second, the waveform split into two distinct layers, one stacked directly on top of the other. Both layers carried the same breathing-like rhythm, but they were out of phase, as if two versions of the same sound had been recorded a fraction of a moment apart. In that overlap, the frequencies clashed and twisted, creating a harsh, metallic resonance that didn't match any known instrument, appliance, or environmental sound in the house. It lasted exactly 0.7 seconds. Then it vanished. This overlap became known among the team as the double presence. It suggested that whatever passed in front of the recorder at 2:47 a.m. didn't simply move once, it flickered, appearing twice in nearly the same position, separated by an almost imperceptible gap in time. Such an effect could, in theory, be produced by mechanical failure, but the recorder's motor logs showed no stutter, no interruption. The tape advanced steadily. The glitch was not in the machine, it was in whatever the machine was hearing. To visualize this, an analyst converted the audio into a three-dimensional model, a kind of topographic map of sound. The 0.7-second window rose like a ridge, with two peaks side by side where there should have been only one. The rest of the fragment was uneventful. Only that fraction of a second held the double imprint. Only that instant suggested the recorder was reacting to more than one version of the same event. Meanwhile, a separate team studied the thermal data from the house. Though the building had no advanced environmental monitoring system, the heating controls logged basic temperature changes throughout the night. These readings, combined with the furnace's cycle records, created a crude thermal timeline. Most of it was unremarkable: gradual cooling, occasional small rises when the heating engaged. But two anomalies stood out. The first was the sharp drop already known to investigators, occurring just minutes before the 2:47 a.m. recording. The second was a localized cold spot registered at 2:48 a.m., only a minute after the tape stopped. It was brief, concentrated, and limited to the area around the basement. The upstairs temperature remained stable. Downstairs, near the floor, sensors indicated a sudden 3-degree dip, as if a pocket of air had been drained of heat. This cold spot aligned almost perfectly with the end of the audio fragment. As the breathing faded, the temperature fell. Then, slowly, both returned to baseline. One expert suggested a draft from an unseen crack in the foundation. Another countered that such a crack would not create a single, tight pocket of cold. It would create a continuous gradient. The data looked less like a draft and more like a void, an absence, not an intrusion, as though something had occupied the air, altering its temperature, then withdrawn all at once. The investigators tried to correlate the thermal anomalies with the electrical disturbances. When they layered the graphs together, the power dips, the brief logging blackout, the temperature drop, a pattern formed. Each disturbance clustered around specific time points, all connected to the basement and the tape. The house's systems reacted as if something moved through them, not just around them, disrupting their function without leaving physical damage. Then came the photographs. Early crime scene photos of the basement showed a faint blur near the shelf where the recorder had been found, a distortion in the air that most assumed was a camera artifact, motion blur, lens smudge, dust. But when the images were enhanced, the blur took on a shape that couldn't be dismissed so easily. It curved around the shelf edge, hugging it tightly, almost like a transparent layer laid over the scene. The grain of the wall behind it appeared stretched, as if the photograph itself were being pulled. On the opposite side of the room, in another image taken only seconds apart, a coil of cable appeared slightly shifted from its previous position. It was a small change, almost laughably insignificant on its own. But in sequence, the photographs told a story the report never did. Something passed between them, close enough to distort light, close enough to tug at objects too lightly to be noticed in the moment, but visibly enough to register on film. This led one analyst to test a new theory. If the tape had truly captured two overlapping presences in the 0.7-second window, perhaps the house had done the same in other ways. He requested access to any recordings from outside the property, security cameras, traffic feeds, anything capturing the surrounding area at the time. One nearby gas station camera, the same one that recorded the passing police cruiser, had a brief glitch in its footage at 2:47 a.m. For exactly 2 frames, the image warped, colors smearing horizontally, as though the scene had been stretched and snapped back into place. It was a classic digital artifact, easily blamed on compression errors. Except for one detail. The gas station's DVR system logged no encoding errors. The glitch appeared in the visual feed, but not in the system's error records. To the device, nothing had gone wrong. The camera had simply recorded what it saw. Back inside the house, another overlooked piece of evidence surfaced. A neighbor's camcorder, left recording in her living room overnight because she had fallen asleep while reviewing old family tapes, captured a faint sound from outside around 2:50 a.m. The audio was muddy, drowned by indoor noise, but when isolated and amplified, the sound resembled a low, distant hum rising in short waves. It lasted about 10 seconds, then faded. Its frequency peaks matched, almost exactly, the resonance at the center of the 2:47 a.m. tape. The hum was not loud enough to wake anyone. It was barely loud enough to exist, but the machines heard it. The camera, the recorder, the answering machine. Devices designed to capture the world as it is, not as it feels. As investigators reconstructed the final hours before dawn, they were forced to contend with an unsettling possibility. The house might not have been experiencing a single anomaly, but a series of aligned disturbances, each one leaving a fragment of evidence on a different medium. Audio, electrical, thermal, visual, none of them complete, all of them pointing to something that moved through the property like a shadow cast in 4 dimensions. The turning point came when one analyst noticed a subtle irregularity in the tape's background noise. Beneath the breathing rhythm and the low-frequency hum, there was a faint pattern, a stuttering, distant echo that repeated at irregular intervals. When the audio was cleaned and inverted, the pattern became clearer. It wasn't echo, it wasn't feedback, it was a reflected signal, as though the recorder were picking up its own hiss bounced back from somewhere impossibly far inside a small room. That impression led to a chilling conclusion. The basement tape didn't just capture what stood in front of it, it captured what surrounded it, what pressed against the boundaries of the space itself. The double presence, the overlapping breath, the reflected hiss, all of it suggested that, for less than a second, the room behaved like a chamber with no clear edges, a place where sound had more than one path to travel. In other words, at 2:47 a.m., the basement stopped behaving like a normal room. And if the environment itself changed shape for even a fraction of a second, then the anomalies throughout the house, missing time, warped light, displaced objects, double-layered sound, weren't random at all. They were symptoms of a single event too large for any one device to record. The tape was just the only witness that tried. In the weeks that followed, investigators attempted to align every anomaly into a single, coherent chain of events, hoping that enough repetition would turn chaos into clarity. But the closer they came to building a timeline, the more the timeline began to fracture. Each device in the house, each piece of machinery, each system meant to function independently, reacted to something that left no physical trace. And like fragments of a broken mirror, the events created a reflection that didn't belong to any known reality inside the home. When analysts plotted the disturbances, 12:31 a.m., 1:17 a.m., 2:46 a.m., 2:47 a.m., 3:03 a.m., a pattern formed, not a straight sequence, but a curve, a looping arc that repeated behaviors in different parts of the house, like a pendulum swinging back and forth through invisible coordinates. These weren't random malfunctions. Each disturbance followed the same order: electrical dip, acoustic distortion, temperature shift, environmental displacement, then silence, then repetition. At 12:31 a.m., the recorder's motor twitched. Too weak to turn the tape, but strong enough to leave a timestamp behind. No sound was captured, no breath, no hum, just a hint of contact, like a finger brushing a sleeping animal. At 1:17 a.m., the phone call collapsed for 18 seconds, the sound bending outward as though the room lost cohesion. The caller heard Kurt's breathing change, not in panic, but in confusion, as if he felt someone or something near him. The background noise returned altered, deeper, carrying an echo of space that didn't exist in the greenhouse. At 2:46 a.m., the house's internal sensors failed for 32 seconds. No electricity flickered, no appliance reset. Only the monitoring logs blinked out, erasing a thin slice of reality from the digital record. At 2:47 a.m., the recorder awakened. Its dead battery surged just long enough to capture 5 seconds of layered sound, a room doubling itself, overlapping breaths in an impossible rhythm, a presence that flickered twice in less than a second. The tape caught what the sensors couldn't hold, the moment the anomaly manifested physically. At 3:03 a.m., the second disturbance swept through the basement, brushing dust away, shifting objects, warping light in photographs, bending air currents and temperature gradients. And then, just as abruptly, it vanished, leaving the house stunned into stillness. Reconstructing these moments required more than data. It required intuition, the ability to read absence as presence, to treat silence as evidence, to accept that whatever passed through that house did not behave like a person moving through space. It behaved like a pressure front, like a pocket of air collapsing inward, taking the room with it, then releasing it intact. One analyst proposed a chilling possibility that the disturbances weren't caused by something entering the house, but by something returning to it. This idea gained credibility when they re-examined a journal entry Kurt wrote months earlier. It stays quiet until it comes back. Always the same hour. The note had been dismissed as metaphor, part of the poetic grief threaded through his writing. But paired with the timestamps, it felt less like symbolism and more like measurement. The 12:31 a.m. anomaly, the 1:17 a.m. collapse, the 2:47 a.m. recording, the 3:03 a.m. spike. Each event happened within a window Kurt had mentioned before, a window he claimed repeated on nights when he couldn't sleep, a window he described as the quiet part that starts breathing. Investigators learned that during his final weeks, Kurt complained to a friend about the house changing shape when he walked through it at night. He spoke about moments where rooms felt narrower, the air denser as if something pressed against him invisibly. Sometimes, he said, I feel like I'm walking through someone else's space. At the time, the friend thought he meant emotional distance, the weight of fame, the collapse of normal life, but the timeline suggested something far more literal. Consider what the evidence showed: a recorder activating without touch, sound overlapping itself, temperature falling in pockets, door frames warping under invisible strain, dust prints appearing and disappearing, 2 rooms imprinting onto a single second of tape. The house behaved like a place visited by something that did not conform to its boundaries, something that exerted force not through physical contact but through displacement of sound, heat, time. The final breakthrough came when the team overlaid all the anomalies into a single visualization. Each disturbance radiated outward from the basement, forming concentric patterns, as though the 2:47 a.m. event was not the beginning but the center. The earlier and later anomalies were ripples, precursors and aftershocks of whatever manifested in that moment. The recorder didn't capture sound, it captured arrival. In this reconstruction, Kurt was not interacting with the anomaly when it appeared. He was simply present in a house where something else entered, lingered briefly, and receded. The question wasn't why the recorder turned on. The question was why it turned on for him. At 2:47 a.m., the anomaly passed inches from the microphone. At 3:03 a.m., it brushed the walls upstairs. At 1:17 a.m., it passed through the greenhouse. At 12:31 a.m., it approached and withdrew. And when the sun rose a few hours later, the house was normal again. Silent, steady, indifferent, its systems stable, its anomalies folded neatly into the night, leaving nothing behind but the fragments captured by machines too simple to interpret them. Kurt left no record of sensing anything that final night, no note, no journal entry, no phone call describing fear, but 2 pages from his notebook, found later between scraps of lyrics, contained a single unfinished sentence written in shaky handwriting. It wasn't here before. Below it, a second line, lighter, almost erased, read, and it came back the same way. The investigators could not explain the anomalies. They could not define the presence that moved through the house. They could only state what the evidence suggested, that the final hours before dawn were shaped not by human footsteps but by distortions that rewrote the environment momentarily, briefly enough to ignore, yet clearly enough to register. Whatever the basement tape recorded at 2:47 a.m., it wasn't a malfunction, it wasn't interference, it wasn't an echo of the past. It was something entering, something leaving, something passing close enough for the house to feel it. And Kurt Cobain was there when it did.